So Donald Trump hasn't had a good election in a little while, but there is one place where he seemingly can't stop winning, his own golf courses. He claimed last weekend that he won not just the senior club championship at his West Palm Beach golf course, but also the regular club championship against seemingly much younger competitors. Trump has claimed such victories a dozen times, I think now. If you could hold an event and declare yourself the winner,
oh my gosh,
what would it be?
For me, it would be the National Spelling Bee. I lost the Spelling Bee in 2004, and it's one of the haunting memories of my life, failing on the national stage of a National Spelling Bee. So I would declare myself a National Spelling Bee champ.
And would you hold it in your living room too?
Yeah, I was going to say, it's not too late. Like, you could just throw a spelling bee in which you know all the answers ahead of time.
I don't know that I'd hold it in my living room, but hold it somewhere where everyone would see that I finally won.
Welcome to the Campaign Moment. I'm Martine Powers. It's Friday, March 29th. So glad to be here. If you are listening to this, you're probably listening in either one of two ways. You might be hearing this in your Post Reports podcast feed in the usual way, where my colleague Elahe Azadi and I have been bringing you these conversations every Friday. Or you might be listening in our brand new separate podcast feed for the Campaign Moment. Today, of course, we have senior political reporter Aaron Blake, author of the Campaign Moment newsletter. Aaron, hello.
Good to be here again.
We also have our esteemed colleague, as I call him, Josh the Scoop Machine Dawsey. Josh, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Aaron, maybe you can talk a little bit about what these conversations have been so far and why we are now putting them in a new feed.
Yeah, so, I think the idea behind this is that, I go into the office and I run into my colleagues like Josh Dawsey, and we talk about the campaign. We talk about what's happening in politics, and we, give our own kind of little analysis of what's happening. The idea is that we bring that to people in a podcast form. We let people in on those conversations in certain ways. And so, I think it fits with Post Reports, and I think it's also kind of its own thing where we're having these roundtable discussions, and, when there are big developments during the campaign, we're going to have, emergency podcasts potentially discussing what just happened. I think that's why people should subscribe to the Campaign Moments feed as well.
So, as Aaron said, that is a separate Campaign Moment feed, but you will also be able to listen to these conversations still on Fridays on Post Reports. Today on this episode, we're going to be talking about Trump's hush money case, which now has a beginning of the trial date officially. We're going to be talking about third-party candidates, but I actually want to start by talking about the Republican National Committee. Josh, you have been doing some reporting on the RNC and how election denialism has become sort of a prerequisite for employment at the RNC. Tell me a little bit about the story that you've been reporting.
Yeah, it's been a very tumultuous time at the RNC over the past several weeks. Former President Trump decided that Ronna McDaniel, the former RNC chair, needed to be replaced. And he replaced her with Michael Whatley, who was the chair of the North Carolina Republican Party and a loyalist, his daughter-in-law as the co-chair, Lara Trump, and one of his top aides as sort of a chief operating officer. And one of the reasons that he wanted Daniel replaced was that he thought she was not doing enough on quote-unquote election integrity and had not done enough in 2020 to sort of promote his false Stop the Steal claims.
But I was confused by that because didn't she do things in 2020 that promoted his Stop the Steal claims?
Some, but not everything that he wanted. I mean, she sort of promoted in the beginning, right after the election, different irregularities that she said. She made some claims of vote stealing. She obviously let Sidney Powell and Rudy Giuliani have an infamous press conference in her lobby. She arranged some of the false electors. She later said she only thought it was a contingency plan. But she sort of backed away long before others did and stopped using the Republican Party's microphone really after when sort of other of his lawyers backed away as well. She did do some to promote sort of the false claim that the election was stolen, but it wasn't as much as he wanted.
So you were saying that at this point now, there's a sense of we don't want her kind in RNC.
So he sends one of his advisors, Chris LaCivita, into the building. LaCivita's famous for the 2004 Swift boat ads against John Kerry, sort of a bald, bare-knuckle political brawler. And the first thing he does is fire a lot of people. Then the party says they're going to cut some of their biggest programs under her. They later reverse course and say that they're not cutting programs after all, after a lot of backlash from other Republicans. And then they tell everyone they fired, you can reapply for your jobs. And here's where it gets interesting. Top Trump advisors come into the building. They start asking these folks who are reapplying to do interviews. These people were running operations in states, let's say, like North Carolina and Arizona and Nevada and sort of key 2024 states. And they ask them a bunch of questions that you would expect. Your experiences, have you worked for Trump before? What do you do? And then they say, oh, and by the way, do you think the election was stolen? And sort of leave in their mind, okay, this is a litmus test now to be hired at the RNC. So when you see Trump sort of remaking or trying to remake the RNC through his proxies and emissaries, one of the things they're trying to do is weed out folks that they don't view as loyal and they don't view who will go as far as he wants them to go. And this question was part of that.
Interesting. So it's like the non-rhino test.
Yeah, that's a pretty good way to put it.
In a way, it's not too surprising. Like, the Republican Party broadly endorses this claim. If we look at the primary states that have been voting so far, we see upwards of 60% of voters who are voting in Republican primaries believe falsely that the 2020 election was stolen. And we've seen a number of Republican office holders and officials like Ronna McDaniel who obviously felt compelled to at least offer a version of Donald Trump's election denial. They may not have, said the very wrong and vast claims about hundreds of thousands of stolen votes and voting machines and things like that. But a lot of them offered a very kind of toned down version of it that allowed people to think that there was something amiss here. And so, I think this is very much in keeping with Trump's apparent plans if he retakes the White House of having loyalists in a number of administration positions, getting rid of, people who are not loyal to him. But also it is kind of, in one way, just a test of like, how far are you willing to suspend your disbelief in order to come work for me? How much are you willing to set aside your better judgment and maybe say things that you don't believe in order to do this job? And so I think in a lot of ways it fits with him, but it is a striking story that we have come to this point where this false belief is apparently something of a litmus test to work for one of the two major party national committees.
One of the things that's happening here is not entirely unusual. The apparatus of the Republican Party is merging with a nominee. That happens sort of every cycle. Once the presidential nominee becomes a nominee, they get control of the RNC. And it's not unusual either for the party nominee to want folks around him, I was going to say or her, but it's been him on the Republican side, to agree with them on policies, to agree with them on positions. What is unusual is a position like this that sort of has led to criminal charges, that has been disproven time and time again, that the election was stolen, that a nominee would keep espousing this position and ask people to believe it. Having folks who work for you at a place like the RNC, if you're a presidential nominee, having folks who are loyal, that's not weird. I mean, people want the RNC or the DNC, frankly, with President Biden to be loyal to who the nominee is. But the nominee is testing the limits of how far will you go in your loyalty to me? And that's what's unusual, that most nominees would not continue saying a false and outlandish claim that had led to all of these reverberations. But Trump is different in that way.
Well, and also, Josh, as you alluded to, this is kind of an ironic week for this to be playing out, considering that Ronna McDaniel has also had ramifications for her career kind of in the other direction, based on the fact that she did, to some extent, try to support Trump after 2020 in his efforts to steal the election, and that now that's sort of blown up in her face. Can you describe a little bit about what's been going on at NBC?
Yeah, I think this is one of the most fascinating stories I've seen play out in years. So NBC decides to hire Ronna McDaniel as a political contributor to the network. This happens after NBC and the RNC worked together to stage a GOP debate last fall. The executives become close with Ronna McDaniel. She gets pushed out of the RNC. They decide to hire her and bring her on to the network. And they want her to do both MSNBC and NBC.
Which was surprising to me because I was like, Ronna McDaniel, former head of the RNC, like
Trump's
MSNBC is not...
head-picked.
Yeah.
Trump's hand-picked head of the RNC.
Yeah, like what...
Right.
I was surprised that MSNBC would be interested in having her on, frankly.
Yeah, I think maybe they weren't as much as the NBC executives thought they might be, to be clear. But McDaniel, her hire is announced, touted as sort of an essential voice for viewers in the current American political moment. And there's just an insane backlash, right? Network anchors go on air decrying it. Top talent complains. You saw Joe Scarborough and Mika Brzezinski, Nicole Wallace, Rachel Maddow, Chuck Todd.
We learned about the hiring when we read about it in the press on Friday. We weren't asked our opinion of the hiring, but if we were, we would have strongly objected to it for several reasons.
We believe NBC News should seek out conservative Republican voices to provide balance in their election coverage. But it should be conservative Republicans, not a person who used her position of power to be an anti-democracy election denier. And we hope NBC will reconsider its decision.
There's an avalanche of criticism because of her role in sort of promoting some of the false claims that the election was stolen in 2020. And NBC fires her, pushes her out, or says you're no longer going to be a contributor.
Like after just a couple days.
And what's sort of baffling to me about this is, nothing changed between Friday when they hired her and Tuesday. I mean, it's only the public pressure, right? I mean, nothing changed about her beliefs. They knew what Ronna McDaniel believed on the 2020 election. She said it publicly, right? But this sort of cascade of public criticism led them to back course. Now they have Republicans up in arms against them. McDaniel's thinking about suing them. She's demanding to be paid her $600,000 or more contract over 2 years for the network. There's turmoil inside the ranks at NBC. How did this decision happen?
It's a mess.
It's a total and complete mess.
And I think this really points to a dilemma for the media. And that's the kind of other side of this story, which is like, does NBC and MSNBC have a responsibility to put somebody like Ronna McDaniel on the air to provide a perspective? As I mentioned, so many Republicans who, like Ronna McDaniel, I doubt believe that the election was stolen, have felt compelled to toe that line to some degree. But if you want to get a perspective of a Republican these days, you're probably going to be hiring somebody who has espoused some version of this, 2020 election being a suspect. And so who do you bring on? It basically leaves a bunch of never-Trumpers who don't really reflect the Trump-era Republican Party.
Like they don't feel particularly relevant, frankly.
Exactly. And it's a very difficult decision. And we've been having this discussion, I think, more in earnest than we have in a long time. And I think it's been healthy in certain ways. But it does kind of create, it reinforces why our political ecosystem and our media ecosystem have become so siloed because, media outlets have an interest in putting people out there who aren't going to say false things, who haven't undermined democracy based upon nothing. And so it's a really tough situation. And I think this week just really reinforced that.
I think that's a very astute point that you make, Aaron. If you really want to get a version of Trumpism on your airways and you want someone who embodies what he is, who can speak, with passion, with some credibility about what Trump believes, what Trump wants, what his base wants, what MAGA wants. It's hard to imagine you'd get someone who said the election wasn't stolen and that I don't believe any of these claims are fraud, right? I mean, an NBC person said to me earlier this week, okay, so they don't want us to have Ronna representing Trump on air. Who do they want, right? Do they want Stephen Miller? Do they want Kellyanne Conway? Do they want
or do we just like straight up accept that we're just not going to have
or do we just say
relevant Republicans
right, because,
on our shows?
You look at a lot of the Republicans who are on frequently are Alyssa Farah, who was a Trump White House comms director but now is an ardent critic. Chris Christie, who was a supporter, now an ardent critic. You can name all of them who are on TV nonstop. How often do you see someone on CNN, MSNBC who is truly representing the Trump point of view? Right? It's not many people. And maybe you want that, maybe you don't want that, but that's just reality.
Josh, you mentioned former Governor Chris Christie, and I feel like that's a good jumping off point to talk about our next subject, which I find eternally fascinating, but also kind of frustrating to try to understand, which is third-party candidates and what is going on with these two different, third-party groups that are trying to become a part of this election. I will be honest and say that it was embarrassingly recently that I realized that no labels and independence are actually separate things. Because I was like, well, if you're independent, you're independent from labels. So aren't you no labels? What is the difference between these two political parties, and why do we have kind of two sets of, not in name, but two sets of independents who are trying to get in there and shake things up?
Yeah, with no labels, you have sort of an outside group that's been espousing, a different path for the country, and that the two-party system is broken, and that you would have a lot of donors and institutional support who would go for a candidate on a third-party ticket, the no labels ticket. The problem they've had is they've been unable to convince anyone to do it, right?
And you're reporting this week about Chris Christie, who was apparently considering it and then said no.
So they do all of this luring of Chris Christie after they've tried to lure multiple others. And Christie takes it seriously. His team commissions polling, he does focus groups, he talks to donors, he sort of maps out what a budget would look like. He does all of the logistical things that you would do before considering it, and then realizes because of ballot access in some states, there's just no path. Because some states he wouldn't be able to win, there's just no way to do it, right? So there's been this frenzied effort by no labels to get a candidate.
But is their goal to win, or is their goal to just peel off enough Trump voters to make sure that Trump isn't president again?
Well, I don't think we really know, right? I mean, they would say their goal is to win, but sure. But the question is, do you peel off voters from Trump, or do you peel off voters from Biden? I mean, there are a lot of the critics of no labels think that if they get a candidate or they got someone to do it, they would actually be cutting into independent and Democrat support of Biden, and it might help Trump. And that's what you see, this sort of frequent criticism of no labels. And then independents, obviously, you have RFK and potentially other candidates who are trying to map out a different path to the presidency.
And he just announced this week a running mate, Nicole Shanahan, which is a name that I wasn't familiar with. Who is she, and why did Robert Kennedy Jr. choose her as his potential VP?
Well, he gave a lot of reasons why he chose her in his speech yesterday about her holistic views of health and her background in the relationship in California. But one of the reasons is she has a lot of money, right? And it sort of propels his candidacy in a different way.
She's like a tech executive, right?
Tech lawyer, Silicon Valley lawyer, I think is the ID that we've been using.
Yeah. The RFK thing is super interesting, too. I mean, Trump came out last night and started attacking RFK as being too liberal and XYZ. But it's been something constantly on his mind. I mean, I've talked to multiple sources who've had dinner with him at Mar-a-Lago who say that he looks around the table and he polls people. How do you think RFK is going to do? Does he help me? Does he help Biden? What should we do about RFK? It's sort of on his mind constantly. I mean, if you look at 2016 and what happened with Jill Stein and sort of a small set of voters she got, but they really mattered. RFK, the expectation is that he will get more than Stein did, and it sort of depends on what states he gets on the ballot, who those voters are. Do they peel away from Biden? Do they peel away from Trump? I don't think anyone expects him to win. I don't think anyone expects him to even get close to winning. But the way our political system is set up with the Electoral College and so few voters whose votes actually matter when it comes down to selecting a president, a few thousand votes here and there can make all the difference in the world.
Yeah, and I think it's important to note, too, that these third-party candidates are polling better than basically any third-party candidates in the last, since Ross Perot in the 1990s.
Really?
The high watermark since then was the 2016 race that Josh mentioned, where we had Gary Johnson as the Libertarian nominee, Jill Stein as the Green Party. But right now, these candidates are polling more of the vote than those candidates ever did in the polls. Mm-hmm. The thing with third-party candidates is they almost always fade as the election goes on. When you get closer to the election, people want to choose between the two candidates who have a shot of winning. But we do have an election in which the two major party candidates are as unpopular as any two major party candidates we've ever seen before, even more unpopular in a lot of polls than we saw in that 2016 race. And so that creates a situation in which these third-party candidates, even if they can't win, the number of votes they poll and who they poll them from is really important. And so we've seen the Democratic National Committee set up basically an operation that is intended to go after RFK Jr. and remind people of the ways in which he aligns with Republicans on certain issues. And there are some really interesting dynamics here because Republicans like RFK Jr. a lot better than Democrats do. But right now he's pulling about evenly between the two parties for a number of reasons, one of which is I think the Democratic kind of malaise a little bit about Joe Biden. So this is a very significant factor in this race. And so that's why Donald Trump is concerned about it. And that's why the Democratic National Committee is, gearing up and using people that are focused on this issue.
Interesting. Well, that's a good place for us to take a pause. After the break, we are going to talk about the hush money trial in New York. We'll be right back. So, Josh and Aaron, we finally have a trial date for the Trump hush money Stormy Daniels trial in New York, April 15th. It really seems at this point that is going to happen. Aaron, I'm curious, what are you kind of expecting to be paying attention to?
Yeah, I mean, look, this is a big moment. We're 2 weeks away from a former president going on trial for the first time. I think, though, that the fact that it's this case is less than ideal for the kind of anti-Trump movement. There have been a number of polls that suggest that people just don't view this case as ranking alongside the others. Those are some very serious cases involving election subversion, allegedly, involving classified documents that could jeopardize national security. There was a Quinnipiac University poll last year that showed just 32% of Americans thought that the charges in Manhattan were very serious. That's compared to 51 to 56% for the other cases. Another poll showed 34% thought that Trump had done something illegal in this case. Again, double digits less than the other cases. Only 55% of Democrats thought Trump did something illegal. These are early reviews of a case that people just don't really understand, I think, in a lot of ways. It's very much in the weeds. It's about falsifying business records and doing that in furtherance of a crime. And a lot of things can change once we actually have the trial. But I think having this go first and be the one, potentially the only one that comes before the election is kind of a suboptimal situation for the effort to hold Trump legally accountable. And I think in certain ways, if the kind of novel legal theory that's involved here doesn't work, this could actually play to Trump's advantage because he very much wants to argue that he has been persecuted by the legal system, that they're coming after him with just anything, and that it's all very thinly substantiated. This is definitely kind of the least substantial case that we see, the most legally novel prosecution justification that we've seen. And so I think it raises a lot of very significant questions about how much this is going to matter and how it's going to play in the general election. A lot of people say that if Donald Trump is convicted, that's disqualifying for them. A significant enough number of people that it could swing the election. But this is definitely a case that people maybe don't feel as strongly about. And so that may not apply in this case.
Yeah, Josh, do you think that's true, that this could potentially be beneficial for Trump, this trial?
I'm very wary of making predictions. I will say it is viewed largely by legal experts, by people we've talked to, by Trump's lawyers, as quote unquote, the runt of the cases, as someone put it to us. You have a case that's about the 2016 election, about him paying off hush money to a porn star, right? I mean, that's the core of what this case is. Part of the challenge for prosecutors is that one of the key witnesses is a porn star. Another key witness is a convicted lawyer that worked for Trump, Michael Cohen, who has not had a history of always telling the truth. That the Southern District of New York federal prosecutors looked at this case, investigated for years, and decided not to bring charges. I mean, there are lots of things that Trump's lawyers have at their advantage here. And I think the prosecutors know that. I mean, there are some salacious and seedy facts here that coming back into the public's mind, I don't imagine helps necessarily with independent voters and general election voters. But I would agree with Aaron that it's viewed as sort of the least damaging of the accusations against him. I mean, what's playing out in this courtroom in the next few weeks, a former president on trial for felonies, it might be the only time this plays out. If you look at the J6 case being held right now for the Supreme Court, even if the Supreme Court gives us a ruling in June and allows it to proceed, there might be a trial this fall. There could be a trial this fall, but that's very challenging timing for the Department of Justice. You have a judge in Florida on the classified documents and obstruction case who has not set a trial date yet, is looking at all of these motions, has written some motions that have confounded prosecutors.
You have the Georgia case, which
and the
is
Georgia
a
case,
little bit
which
of a
is
mess
sort
at
of
this
a mess
point
as well right now at this point. So you have a former president who's been accused of a lot of different things. And the first thing that he's going on trial for is in 2016, before he won the election, paying off money to a porn star, before charges about J6 and whether he tried to overturn the election, charges about whether he took classified documents and evaded efforts to give them back, charges about what he did in Georgia, right? All of these things that happened since and that sort of have been at the fore of people's minds, in a lot of critics' minds as his worst conduct, are not going first.
Here's my question. And Josh, I'm specifically curious for your perspective on this, because I think of you a little bit as like a former President Trump whisperer. But like, how is Trump going to conduct himself during this trial? I mean, I assume that he's going to be there.
He doesn't have a choice.
Okay. That's helpful to understand.
Yeah.
But I did see that the judge issued a gag order.
Right.
So he can't really talk about it. He can't do like the usual thing of like coming out and tweeting, witch hunt or, this is all an attack on me. Or maybe he can. I think the details of the gag order.
The gag orders are limited in that he can criticize the judge even, but he can't criticize court staff or witnesses. I think you will see him do a lot of his public bombast and invective about how unfair this is, but he is limited by the gag order, right? And, in some of the other trials where he's come to court, we've seen him try and not answer questions and give what they said in the New York civil case was political speeches. We've seen him do press conferences outside the courtroom. We've seen him sort of argue with his lawyers in public about strategy at the defense table. I mean, he is a very engaged defendant. And I think just sort of to clarify that, I mean, the reason he's so engaged is Trump realizes right now that one of two things is likely to happen to him. He's going to win the presidency, and a lot of his legal and financial problems vanish, if not all, immediately. Or he loses the presidency, and he probably faces a lot more trials. He faces all sorts of lawsuits. He faces just headache after headache after headache after headache. I mean, one of his people said to me recently, he's running for his freedom. And I think that's sort of the way to put yourself in Trump's mind, to say all of these cases are incredibly important to him in this election, because it's not just another election like 2016 or 2020.
Like, this is existential.
This is sort of his entire life. He's 77 years old.
Forward.
What does the last chapter of his life look like? Do his problems go away? Or do his problems multiply and manifest themselves in all sorts of new ways? So that's sort of what I'm watching on that.
Yeah, I would say there's no question he is going to be everywhere when this trial is going. He can't help himself in certain ways. It is existential for him. What we've also seen, though, is that when he feels the need to constantly be in the public eye, that doesn't always accrue to his benefit. I think a big reason why he's in a relatively good position in the election right now, according to the polls, is that people have decided they like him a little bit better as he's been less in the news. And I think one thing that's going to be interesting and worth watching is once Trump is back in their faces for every day after this trial, holding press conferences outside the courtroom, saying things, attacking the judge's family, potentially attacking the DA. Are these things that people want to see in a president, or are they going to be reminded of the things that they didn't like about Trump when he was actually in the White House? And so I think those are very significant questions here, even aside from the substance of the prosecution.
All right. Well, on that note, Josh, thank you so much for being here. It was really a pleasure.
Yeah, it was a pleasure being with you guys, and look forward to coming back sometime.
And Aaron, of course, thank you again. I'm so excited to have you here every week.
Thank you, Martine. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Josh Dawsey is an investigative political reporter for The Post, and Aaron Blake is a senior political reporter and author of the Campaign Moment newsletter. We have the link in our show notes and at postreports.com.
By the way, Josh, what place did you come in the spelling bee?
Well, I did not come close. I went out in the third round on the word repechage, which is spelled Repechage.
Okay.
And that is a new word for all of you at home.
What? I've never heard this word. Repechage?
Repechage is a French word.
What does it mean?
I don't exactly remember.
Well, you don't really need to know that for the spelling bee. Yeah. It turns out. So.
Let's not talk about my trauma anymore for today.
That's it for today's episode of The Campaign Moment. Thank you so much for listening. This weekend, we are going to be having a bonus episode on Post Reports that is about Beyonce, her new album, and her impact on country music. You will definitely want to listen to that, so keep an eye out in your feed on Sunday. Today's show was produced and mixed by Ted Muldoon. It was edited by Renita Jablonski. Our team also includes Maggie Penman, Rena Flores, Lucy Perkins, Monica Campbell, Alana Gordon, Ariel Plotnick, Bishop Sand, Rennie Spernovsky, Sabi Robinson, Emma Talkoff, Sean Carter, Peter Bresnan, Allison Michaels, and Alahe Izadi. I'm Martine Powers. We'll be back on Sunday with more stories from the Washington Post.